Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from today. I'm Becca, I'm Engagement Manager at Comma Press. If you're not familiar with Comma, we are a independent, not-for-profit publisher based in the UK, and we specialise in the short story form. Thank you so much for coming to this book launch today for our latest anthology, which is the Book of Jakarta. We published this book just before Christmas, just as the UK went into another pandemic lockdown. So sadly, we haven't had any public-facing physical events for this book yet. This is our first kind of launch event for this anthology. We're so delighted that you could all join us. A bit of housekeeping before we start. I would recommend toggling to speaker view in the top right corner, which means that you'll see on screen the person who's speaking at the time, unless you want to look at everyone's faces, that's entirely up to you. We'd ask that you stay on mute, as I've said, just so it's clear when the panelists are talking. If you're struggling with internet bandwidth, we'd recommend also turning off your video. That can sometimes help with the connection. And if you have a question, we'd ask that you put it in the chat box, which is in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions at any point in the chat box, and I'll be reading them out to our panelists at the end of the event. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Helen Vassallo, who is the founder of the Translating Women project and the host of today's event. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks so much, Becca, and thank you very much for inviting me to host this event. I'm very excited to be here and to welcome our three speakers, and of course to welcome everybody who's attending. Thank you so much for joining us for this virtual launch of the Book of Jakarta. As Becca said, my name's Helen Vassallo. I'm delighted to be here today talking with authors Ratri, Ninditya, Ziggy, Zesyazevieonnazabriskie, as well as translator Rara Rizal about this important new collection from Comma Press. So many of you will already be familiar with the Reading the City series by Comma Press. So they're collections of short stories that depict a particular city, usually focusing on cities and languages that might be less mainstream. And this latest offering is intriguing. I must hold it up in case you don't have a physical copy because it's beautiful. And so coming as it does from a country that's diverse in terms of its geography, languages and ethnicity, but focusing on the capital city, a place of advancement and disenfranchisement. Several themes recur throughout the collection: modern dystopias, social division, people on the margins, shifting perspectives, and the hectic pace of a city constantly in motion. From an aging sex worker to street buskers, a group of senior citizens left behind by modern life to a homeless artist. The voices are diverse, but they all speak from a place of dissent, a place of exclusion from a capitalist regime. So it's my great pleasure to introduce two of the authors and one of the translators featured in this collection. So first of all, Ratri Ninditya is a poet and short story writer. Her first poetry collection, Roots and Nothing, was published in 2019 and shortlisted for the Kusala Sastra Katulistiwa Award in 2020. And I must apologise if my pronunciation of any of this is dire. I'm doing my best with a language very unfamiliar to me, so please be forgiving if I make mistakes. After 8 years working as a copywriter in various multinational advertising agencies, Ninin took a master's in cultural studies at the University of Sydney and currently works in Jakarta as a researcher focusing on cultural policy. Then next we have Ziggy Zesyazevieonnazabriskie, who is an award-winning Indonesian fiction writer. She won the Jakarta Arts Council novel writing competition in both 2015 and 2016 and has received multiple other literary accolades. Ziggy mainly writes about children and social criticism in the forms of both literary and popular fiction. And finally, our third participant is Rara Rizal, the co-founder of the translators collective In Other Words. She is also an interpreter and a poet. Her home will always be Pangkep, but she has come to love Jakarta. And that leads us beautifully into talking about the Book of Jakarta. And I will launch straight in with the questions. I'm going to speak to Ninin first about your story B217 or B217 AN. which you can tell me if there's a different way we should have mentioned that number. So this story embodies two themes that are very present in the Book of Jakarta: movement and the outskirts. The characters we find both physically and figuratively on the margins of a life they feel disconnected from, and they're constantly in motion, trying to find something more satisfactory, but still afraid to go too far. So how did the idea for this last date come about? And secondly, how do its themes fit within your body of work more generally?
Okay, hi Helen. Thank you for having me here. Hi everyone. So I wrote this story back in 2016, actually, when I was experiencing a major burnout from working in advertising and having to commute from home to work for in total 3 hours every day. And at that time, I think that everyone in Jakarta is going on in this long and winding journey that leads to nowhere, just as me. And people are figuring ways to escape, but keep falling to the same trap. And in this story, this last date, I think is a petty attempt of the narrator to experience a sense of freedom, while the marriage plan is also her attempts to escape structural barriers somehow. Because in Jakarta, expats earns like 10 times more than the locals. So like marrying an expat would be like a kind of an escape, sort of. So I think the character in the story are marginalized in some aspects, but they also have certain kind of privileges, and that tension is what I want to point out also in the story. And then I think in my story, I see the motion as an illusion of mobility, and nobody knows where they're going to, and everyone just go around in circle in the outskirts, like you said. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think you're happy to read us an extract from your story.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay.
And can you confirm the title as well? Tell me which way we should.
So it's B217AN. It's actually a pun, berdua satu tujuan, which means I'll translate it literally as together one destination. So it's a yeah. I'm just gonna explain that. I'll read the excerpt now.
Thank you.
Berdua satu tujuan, translated by Mikael Johani. Tomorrow I'm getting married, and tonight I rest my head on your shoulder. You swerve your scooter around these alleys as if you know their ins and outs like the back of your hand. The further we go, the less I know where we're going. Doesn't matter, I think. I want to go even further. The narrower the alley gets, the more room to drown myself in. Rows and rows of tiny square houses. Every now and then, a cigarette stall. A badminton court sun's net. The rubbed outlines of smack of desperations. The sound of a boy reciting the Quran blares out from the mosque speakers. Other boys scream and run away from their mothers, not wanting to go home just yet. A brown river snakes in my right, sometimes narrowing, sometimes widening. A snack wrapper is trapped between two rocks, the current not strong enough to drag it away. We have to go the long way. The main road is impossible to get through. You sound happy, as if nothing has ever happened between us. Last night I sent you a text. I'm getting married in 2 days. I waited for your reply until I fell asleep. This morning you said you wanted to take me to a seafood stall in the suburbs. I also live out in the suburbs, but on the other side of the city. If we don't cut through the center, we will have to go around the outskirts through these narrow alleys. I think that's going to take ages, but I say yes, let's go. It's better that we end this without a fight. This afternoon you picked me up at the usual spot. One angkot ride away from my house, an internet cafe that's now being converted into a shop selling phone top-ups and used mobile phones. When you arrived, The only thing you asked me was, did I bring a raincoat? It's going to bucket down soon. I brought my poncho, I said. Those were the only 3 sentences that have come out of our mouths since. I think that would be it. Thanks.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to hear you read it out loud, and to be transported there, because the style of this, I think, is so evocative, and it feels almost like a movie where you can be immersed in the images as well as the words. So I really enjoyed hearing you read from it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Helen.
Later on in your story is the line that struck me the most, which I'm just going to read out here. People like me have to study really hard to get into the best school, the best university, and then get the perfect job that promises a better life. Sadly, this middle class manual doesn't have a section on how to be content. And there seems to be so much cultural or social comment packed into that. Your narrator is chasing after this elusive happiness that was promised to her but never materializes when she follows the path that she thought would lead there. So to what extent do you think that stagnation is specific to Jakarta? That might tie in with some of the things you spoke about in your first answer. And in what ways do you think it's more universal or perhaps generational?
I think the inability to feel happy is universal. Well, the stakes are actually specific. Like, what probably more specific to Jakarta, especially the lower end of the middle class group, is that the anxieties, if you lost money, you die on the streets. Like, because there's very little government supports, like compared to welfare state countries, for example, for basic needs, such as housing, affordable housing, adequate public transportation, healthcare. The available supports kind of like miss to target the lower end of middle class. So I might say that in Jakarta, although you're well educated, come from middle class family, there's still no guarantee that you can sustain your good life or your proper life, sort of. And then and for me, I think this difference is the implication of long history of colonization, global capitalism, and supremacy. Yeah. So that's.
Yes, and to lead that into Ziggy's story, which is very different, but does still have some connecting themes. So like the last date in Ninin's story, Ziggy, your story, Grown Up Kids, is also about people on the margins and also about endings. So we have a group of senior citizens in an apartment complex who make a suicide pact, and they have a quite creative way of carrying out this pact. And you know, even in the brief description there, we can see the blend of tragedy and humour that comes together in Grown Up Kids. There's also a combination of ideals and banality. So what made you choose these characters and this premise? How did the idea come about?
Okay. Sorry, can you hear me? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I'd like to start with the characters first. It was actually an idea proposed by the editor, so I suppose that needs to be mentioned. The story, unlike Ninin, it was commissioned especially for this book, and the editors told me what sort of story they were looking for from me, and they suggested me to write something based on what I'm known for in Indonesia, which is to write from the point of view of a child, an inanimate object for some reason, or an elderly. And I've never done the last one, so I decided on that. And I realized that using senior citizens as a character will allow me to explore Jakarta from the point of view of a passive participant of the city, which is very close to my real life position, because I don't really participate actively. I don't have like office jobs or something like that in Jakarta. And so I thought, as an elderly, I'd be able to present momentous events as a memory or a recollection. So I'd be able to talk about things that I saw on the news as an object of marvel more than something that you're living through or you're in the middle of, because I don't have that experience. And I thought this way I would also get to talk about observations more broadly, because that's what I really enjoyed from living in Jakarta. I think that there's this ever-changing culture here that's pretty much only ever-changing because this place is so easily swayed, so suggestible, and they're really trying, really eager to try a lot of new things. So I feel like the city is in a perpetual state of being a teenager, but everyone living in it is old. So everyone's really tired, but they're always peer pressured to keep on going. So through the story, I was really trying to focus on such demands from the point of view of people who may or may not have run out of steam. And as for the premise, I was really homesick when I was writing this. So there's an idea of people who really want to get away from the city. I mean, it's really alluring to stay in Jakarta because the city offers affordable luxury and much greater opportunities to explore. I think that there's so many first times ready to be experienced in Jakarta, and it's really captivating. And I think for many, and myself included, I think they're trapped between wanting to find peace or to enjoy that luxury. And so at the end of the story, three of the characters chose peace, and the last one standing remained to pursue luxury. And in relation to that, I think it was also mentioned in the introduction about the relocation of capital of Indonesia from Jakarta to East Borneo, and it's been planned for about 2 years ago. Like, yeah, and I think such relocation would be a way to force Jakarta to rest. But I felt that the city wouldn't go down easily. I think they will cling to the old time glory as long as they could. So I think that in a way, Mrs. P is an embodiment of Jakarta. She's self-centered, she's vicious, self-important, but witty and very, very fun. So I think that's pretty much it.
Yes, and you've alluded to something there that I didn't mention, which is that your story is set in the future.
Yeah.
Further in the future than I realised when I first read it, because we get this flashback to the two of the main characters at an uprising, a demonstration, and I thought that had been in the 1990s, and you let me know that actually it was just something very recent. So we're talking about 60 years in the future, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. I was thinking about
Yeah.
like 15. Yeah.
Those people who were teenagers a couple of years ago or early 20s a couple of years ago are kind of, pensioners now.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
but there was still something so perhaps almost frighteningly or omnisciently believable about the situation that you set up, which I think has really come out in the way that you're talking there. And on that note, I'd like to invite you to read an extract from Grown Up Kids, please, so that we can all hear you read from your wonderful story.
Thank you. That's really generous of you to say wonderful. I wouldn't be able to say that about my work.
Oh, I can say it for you.
Thank you. I will read from the end of page 68. The queue gate was closed. The last riders were already seated, and the ride was about to start. Mrs. Sam looked at the safety harness, which hadn't changed at all over the years. She knew it very well. She smiled and stroked the nuts and bolts with a familiarity that made her quietly weep. From a skirt pocket, she took out a screwdriver. Mrs. N peeked over from the seat beside her, but was too terrified to speak. There were so many people around. Next to her, Mrs. O was weak, pale, still and silent. On the end, Mrs. B stamped her feet and fidgeted like an excited little kid. The attendant gave a signal indicating the ride was about to begin. Mrs. M closed her eyes, drew breath. Mrs. N squeezed her harness so tightly her fingernails turned white. Mrs. O blinked. Mrs. B began to sing I Am a Rock, I Am an Island. Mr. M on the 15th floor of the National Library opened a large window in the archives and looked down, remembering the street he had trodden with his friends in his youth. The spot where they had blocked traffic, angry about proposed laws, about people, about human rights violations, about sausages, and whether there was pork in them. The spot where he had first met his wife, wearing a red jacket and carrying a knapsack that he knew, held 3 packages of buns. He had taken that road to his first job. His wife had often picked him up on that street to drive him home. Mr. M closed his eyes, drew breath. The ride began its ascent. Mrs. M let out a shrill laugh. Then the oversized story shot towards the sky at a speed of 100 kilometers per hour. In the first second, Mrs. Sam's behind was lifted from a seat and went flying like eggs and flowers being tossed at a birthday party. In the second second, still laughing, she let go of a screwdriver, dropped her cell phone. At the National Library, Mr. M jumped. In the third second, the ride began to descend too. Mrs. O made no sound. Mrs. N screamed. Her screams were never ending, louder than any sound that had ever been. Then something happened to Mrs. N. Something in her brain was awakened by the scream and seemed to join in as her body too accelerated. Mrs. N felt like a leopard, strong as a bull, so fired up, so hard, and then suddenly stopped. Just like that, Mrs. N had screamed herself to death. Thank you.
Thank you, Ziggy. So we have these very colourful protagonists who want to leave a life that no longer has any use for them. It's implied that when they were younger, they worked to try and change Jakarta for the better, but then find themselves with no place there. So please, could you talk about the importance of this aspect for your story, this aspect of your story for our understanding of the generational conflict in Indonesia?
This is actually a difficult question because I sincerely cannot talk about generational conflict in Indonesia. I have to tell you that because I can't even begin to pretend that I understand anything about it. And also, I actually really just writing about Jakarta, not the whole Indonesia. Although funnily, Jakarta people have tendency to think that Jakarta is the whole Indonesia. Anyway, the thing is, things that happened and or are happening in Jakarta simply don't, or barely happen in my hometown or any other cities outside of Jakarta or even outside of Java. So I'm still really trying to understand what's actually going on in this place. But I think what I was trying to convey through that part of the story is how no matter what sort of heroics you did, life goes on. So it kind of echoes Ninin's skepticism about lower middle class and its financial aspects and such things. And because, people don't award you for doing your part. And the characters were actually quite well off since they managed to live comfortably until they couldn't anymore. So I think in here I was just really being cynical on how demanding the city is. No matter how much you've advanced them, you've built them, it'll never be enough because the city always wants more. So the whole story was really just me being very anxious about living in Jakarta because I am still really, really scared of living here.
Okay, so it wasn't a flash forward to your own future, though, I hope.
I hope not so. I don't know.
There's a cynicism in one of the characters. You mentioned her earlier, and it becomes especially apparent in the ending, which I don't want to completely spoil for anyone who might not have read it yet, so I'll just leave it at that. But we have an attack on capitalist society, but more subtly, this attack on people who don't or who understand how to exploit it and who are willing to exploit it to make sure they survive. Given that you're known for writing about social criticism, how does the twist in the tale at the end reflect your body of work or your approach to work more generally?
I think my other writings are actually much more subtle than the spike in the story. I had to hasten in making my point here because my words are limited. I'm used to working with 40,000 words, and this one is like only 3,000 words. Usually I put my criticisms under layers and layers of comfort characters or comfort narration, so people would have something else to focus on, because it usually deals with something rather uncomfortable. I wrote about war and family dysfunction and loss, and narrated it from the point of view of a rambling girl who's obsessed with pigs, so people think it's funny. I criticized how people in Indonesia always connect everything with religion in a story that they believe is convincing them to be more religious. So that's the sort of thing that I write, and that's how I write it. And the story is also not a comfortable read, I think, but I didn't have enough space to soften the blow. So I think the way the story represents my writing more generally is that this story actually gives an idea of what I basically write without all the red herrings.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ziggy. And just before I move on to talk about Rara's story, or the story that Rara translated, I realised I completely skipped a question that I had for Ninin, and I'm so sorry. I'm going to return to that now because I feel horrible for not having posed it earlier. But Ninin, I was going to end the section talking about B217AN by talking a little bit more about your work. So you previously worked as an advertising copywriter, and now you research cultural policy for the Indonesia Arts Coalition. So how have those roles influenced your writing of poetry and fiction?
Okay, that's totally fine, Helen. Just give it. I thought you didn't have much time, but yeah. So I think working in advertising was the huge influence in how I write my poetry and stories. That's like global capitalism and consumerism right on my face, right? And then a local worker in a multinational agency in Jakarta stands at the very bottom of the hierarchy, the top being the head office in New York or London. And then most of the profit made in Jakarta has to go all the way to New York or all the way to whatever headquarter it is. And then that is for me the kind of a literal translation of neo-colonialism. And then I became very sensitive on how that operates at the present time. So there is certainly interrogation of that in my stories and poems. And then at the same time, working in advertising, meaning you're the one who creates the middle class desires to buy things, to own things, right? And then so when I started to write poetry, I reflected a lot on human relationships and attachment to things, to like inanimate objects around us, like our desire to own things, how the things that we want or we have or we borrow or we see every day become a part of who we think we are, and then how they at the end define us. So in the process, I used like those objects as a tool to understand and untangle what's going on inside my head. And many times unconsciously and sometimes as deliberate metaphors. And then both in my poems and stories. So like, I think my stories also have the same anxieties as my poems, like middle class desires, boredom, burnout, things like that. And I think working as a researcher recently, which I only started 2 years, a year ago actually, sort of exposed me to like the real life stories faced by artists all over Indonesia, and how the structural barriers are, keep them from creating and sustaining actually their creativity and their work and their career as an artist. And I think, I don't know whether that kind of already like influenced me in my recent writings, but I don't know. Like, I think it's more from working in advertising, I think. Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. And I'm sorry the question came a little later than we expected. But I kind of like where it ended up being placed, because we've heard from both you and Ziggy about your process now and about how you come to those stories. And we'll turn now to a different perspective. So Rara, you have a different perspective on the Book of Jakarta because you worked on it as a translator. You translated Sabda Amandia's short story, The Problem. And like in Ninin's story, there's a sense in The Problem that this formula of work hard, get an education, and you will have success is a myth that leaves young people feeling disenfranchised. And like in both Ninin and Ziggy's stories, the protagonists in The Problem are on the margins of society. So in this case, they're buskers. And from the margins, there are quite a number of social and political comments, particularly about capitalism, about the post-Suharto regime. And so what do you think this perspective brings to this story, this collection, but also perhaps to an outsider's understanding of Indonesia more generally?
Okay, that's a very interesting but also a very difficult question. And I think I want to start by saying, of course, I can't speak for the author who has made the choice to write about these characters. And nor do I speak for the editors, the wonderful Macy and Teddy, who've made a choice to commission and feature this story in a collection titled The Book of Jakarta. So I'm speaking, of course, as a translator who, fortunately or unfortunately, is trained to look at similarities, perhaps in an attempt to find, something to latch on to carry that meaning across languages we tend to see in similarities. So I think that this story highlights the fact that as a society, something only becomes a problem, a capital P problem, when it's starting to affect people who aren't on the margins, right? When police are chasing the salary man down the street. But in fact, in the story, buskers, street vendors, sex workers, marginalized and vulnerable communities, they experience violence, especially violence by authorities, by the state, on a daily basis. So there's a scene in the story where the main character just was casually describing being chased by the civil police as an everyday occurrence when they're trying to earn a living. And I think the idea itself isn't uniquely Indonesian, isn't uniquely Jakartan, but I like that it asks the question, so what is the problem in other societies? It challenges us to look, furthermore, who are on the margins in the UK society, and what problems get overlooked, what problems are treated as an everyday problem, and what problems becomes huge. So I think that's what's interesting. But of course, I'd love to hear also from Dio, from the author, if he's here, and also from Messi and Teddy, if they're here. Yeah.
That's really fascinating, because I think, one thing I really like about the Reading the City series is they're instructive for those of us who know little about the place they're focusing on, but they're never exoticized. There is a universality, and particularly in this collection, where social problems aren't necessarily culturally specific, or they might be culturally specific in the way that they're presented, but we can still, as you say, relate them to things happening elsewhere. And I think that's one of the real strengths of this book and of the whole series. You're happy to read, I think, an extract from The Problem, which you translated?
Yes.
Wonderful. We'll move to that next then. Thank you.
Okay. Time 21:47. The three of them are walking along Palmerah, chatting aimlessly while scanning the area to look for a safe spot to set up their instruments. This is the most fun Gembok's new friend has had in a long time, he confesses. Aside from the co-workers at his boring job, there's no one to talk to, no one to engage in intense and passionate conversations with, not even about ordinary topics like which operating system is better, Mac OS or Windows, iPhone or Android, that sort of stuff. Gembok and Yuli just stare at each other. I used to think I was different to most people, he says. I'm wired different. I tend to choose the path not taken. But then one day I realized that I'm just a cog in the machine. There's nothing special about doing the same things over and over again, stuck in a loop in service of... It is then that Yuli finally realizes for sure that Gembok's new friend is too emo to be a cop. All right, listen, I never seriously thought he was a cop. Despite her denial, Yuli actually did at one point suspect Gembok's new friend of being some sort of a secret cop, or at least he wished he was one, or perhaps that he was related to someone who was. But that was before she heard him saying, I'm just a cog in the machine. And then come to think of it, there's all that business about his father. Nah, I think it's just emo. Strange world we live in, says Gembok's new friend. You've been a rebel all your life, and then one day you wake up and you're sucked into it all. It's quicksand, and I mean it literally. It sucks you dry. It's like, picture this for a moment. Imagine you're in line trying to get into a Slipknot concert. I can't imagine ever wanting to go to a Slipknot concert, cuts Yuli. All right, then, what about this? You're trying to eat at your favorite warung, the best one in town. It's so good, so popular, right, that people are lining up in a queue waiting to get in. But lucky for you, you have enough money to pay people to queue for you. Do you see what's wrong here? Has anyone ever stopped to think about how everything we do revolves around money? I mean, who decided that we needed money in the first place? And who benefits from having money? I think about this all the time. Gembok nods. The analogy seems to make sense at first until Yuli realizes that no warung is actually even ever that crowded to begin with. Educated people sometimes make things up just to prove a point.
Thank you. What a wonderful sentence to end on. So were there any particular linguistic or cultural challenges to your translation work for the Book of Jakarta? Were you in contact with your author while you were translating? And if so, could you talk a bit about what that might have brought to the process?
Yeah, I was in contact with Sabda Armadillo to hone in and strengthen that narrator's voice. I feel like it has to be powerful because not only it's narrating the story, it's also playing God with the characters, dictating what the characters do and what they say. So I want to make sure that I do it justice. And Dio was very encouraging. For me personally, the challenge is translating the voice, although that's not necessarily linguistic or cultural. And as a translator, it's the biggest task is translating the voice of the characters and understanding at least their perspectives, motivations, and their identity in order to get it across. Sorry.
And you run a translation collective, in other words. So from your point of view, what does the landscape look like for translated literature from Indonesian into English? Are there things that we could be doing better? Well, I suspect the answer to that is yes. Why is it important that we do things better?
Yes. Well, first of all, what the landscape looks like. First of all, the landscape is very small. I will, of course, I'll let Ziggy and Ninin elaborate on that. But second of all, the landscape is also very, very wide. I'm speaking from the perspective of a translator. In translation, there's this notion that you can only translate into your native language. And unfortunately, English right now is the predominant target language. So this creates an industry of translators and editors whose first language is English. And I think that what's going on, what happens when you have that notion is that you have English as a first language, or translators who work to translate from another language into English. So then, but at the end, they end up consulting with local translators or fixers to fact check or to edit or proofread, to vet the translation to make sure that they get the meaning right. And I think that this project with Comma Press especially challenges that notion. If that can happen, then why not the other way around? Why can't the industry open up and be more welcoming to non-white translators whose L1 are not English? And because the way I see it, personally, the very first of translating is reading and understanding the work. And who better to do that than people who can carry that meaning to another language? So why not do it the other way? You get the message right first in the original language, and then consult with proofreaders or editors in the target who work in the target language. And I especially appreciate the Comma Press who's trusted my interpretation of the text. And I think I'm very happy to know that I can improve the translation in a sense only that they've made it more idiomatic, or the spelling idiomatic, and also trusting that meaning in the original language, we carry that burden with us as translators who serve in this, whose primary language is the source language.
That's a really positively provocative suggestion, I think. And it's obviously something that's worked very well in terms of the collaboration that you've embarked on with Comma Press in this context. And I think it raises questions about the politics of translation, which was going to be our next focus. And so this question now is to all of you, or to whichever of you would like to comment. Tiffany Tsao recently wrote about the ways in which cultures are packaged. Particularly, she was speaking about the Indonesian context of who chooses what gets published and what barriers there are to getting a fair and diverse representation of Indonesian literature to travel beyond your own borders. And there are a couple of things that you've said in the course of this session, so that people think Jakarta is the whole of Indonesia, or the very interesting things, Rara, that you've just been saying about, you know, white English language translators not necessarily being best placed to understand that situation. So is there anything that any of you would like to add about this packaging of cultures and what more we could do to make sure that there is a greater diversity in the way that Indonesian literature travels to us?
Who wants to go first? Me? Okay, I'll go first. Okay, maybe to add on Rara's point of view, to begin with, despite their diversity, Indonesian writers face many barriers to gain readership in their own locals. With a very limited market, the stakes is quite high for a publisher to explore different style of writing. So they're not taking risk while public funding is scarce, with little transparency and limited reach. The planned government endowment fund for culture is yet to come, but I assume very tiny portion will go to literature. And meanwhile, the literature gatekeepers since the 60s and the 70s have very close relationship with the Western donors and like to exotize Indonesia, having an anti-urban tendency in deciding who gets to the funds and who doesn't, things like that. So, and however, there are opportunities with indie publishers for sure, like Post Santa, who has contributed greatly to literature world in Jakarta, but we don't know how long they'll sustain, right, during this COVID. So with so much homework Indonesian literature got to deal with, translation is yet another battle. And many times we're faced with this global audience who frame us in a certain way. Like for example, this recent case of an Australian paper who wrote about one Indonesian book, which was translated into English and published in Australia. So the article claimed actually that the book has been published in Australia rather than Indonesia, where the writer faced protest and disapproval because of the queer-related theme in the book. So like, while in fact, the book had won first prize in the most prestigious literary award and had been published by the biggest publishing company in Indonesia. So like, I think there's this tendency of foreign media loving stories about repressions by the developing states, countries such as Indonesia, and portrays these countries such as a backward and lacking in freedom, you know, while in reality there's so much more to it. And I think I'm gonna leave others to add.
Is there anything more that you would like to say, Ziggy or Rara?
I think I just really like that Ninin pointed out that the expositizing, because that's something that we are battling not only in translation level, but also in local works, because people have kind of like an expectation on what literature is supposed to talk about. So you're not supposed to only talk about your daily life. You have to talk about something exotic, about cultural this, cultural that. But that's, you know, like your real life is also Indonesian reality. And a lot of people perceive that as something that is not highbrow enough. So I think we are struggling with lots of things, including what we can write about. So there's just so many things that we are struggling right now. So I my head is really not in the translation level yet, because I'm still really you know, feeling a bit anxious about wanting to write something that's not about traditions and everything that people want to read from Indonesia, because, you know, from their point of view, probably Indonesia doesn't have real life problems such as going to school and not having opportunities to work. because that happens everywhere. So they don't really want that universality, because they can see it, they can read it in, from books from anywhere that is not from Indonesia. So I think my head is still filled with that.
Thank you. Rara, is there anything that you would like to add?
Just to quickly, I want to echo Ninin and Ziggy's statement, because there's this sense that Indonesian literature is something that's waiting to be discovered, and mostly discovered by white publishers, white translators, white editors, and we're playing that game. So I think when the question is how do we get a fair and diverse representation of Indonesian literature, I think working and engaging with local editors and local communities to ensure that you see Jakarta, for instance, not the way we see Jakarta, the way ordinary Jakarta people see the Jakarta, and not through some rose-tinted glass. So working with local communities, engaging with local translators and local editors.
Brilliant, thank you. And another question then to Ninin and Ziggy. What does it mean to you to have your work published in English and to engage with a different audience? Bearing in mind all that's just been said about packaging of cultures and the way that culture travels or that literature travels. What does it mean to you to have these works translated?
Yeah, I'm very anxious actually. I've been reading some of the reviews, and I'm actually very glad that the intention of this anthology by presenting translators from Indonesia as a dominant translators working for this project got through, and then the portrayals of diverse Jakarta from different class and privileges point of views got to people, and then I think that's a really good thing for me. Well, I think also maybe I must admit that maybe it's not that easy to connect with different sound or gist of language in English, and going through a city's landscape, and one has just a vague idea about. So yeah, I think I'm just hoping more Indonesian writers could reach wider readership through translations. But yeah.
Thank you. Ziggy, what about you?
I'm not quite sure really. I'm still really processing that this is actually happening. I mean, if it were asked to me a few years back, I would have had all the answers, and it will be that I'm glad and stuff like that. But things changed. I think for a while now, I've been feeling more and more nervous about what's going on around me, and I've been writing in response to that. So I feel that my writings had been made exclusively with Indonesian audience in mind. So, but I think it could be interesting how a story might be understood differently by different audience. One of my books was read by a non-Indonesian reader who can speak Indonesian, and he read it very differently. And I realized that it's because he was bereft of one very Indonesian quality that took Indonesian readers to the Indonesian conclusion. So I think I'm kind of looking forward to seeing whether anything I'd ever written, including the story, or my friends had ever written that had specific Indonesian meaning to be interpreted differently. That's always interesting to explore.
Thanks so much. I can see that some questions from the audience have been popping up, and I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to hand over to Becca now so that she can put those questions to you. If we have time afterwards, I have a couple more general questions up my sleeve, but Becca, do you have the audience questions that you'd like to put to the participants?
I do. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, everyone. That was such a great discussion. I really enjoyed listening in. The first question is from Davina. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. It's very exciting to see a book focusing on Jakarta, as not much is talked/written about this dynamic city. With that in mind, what would you expect the international readers would perceive of Jakarta after reading this book? What do you guys think?
Hi, Davina, my friend. maybe I'm gonna answer first.
Yeah, please.
I think I'm just hoping that people will see Jakarta not just as a dot in a map anymore, but a place where people are breathing and living and negotiating every day with their privileges and marginalities, with what they have and what they can't have. So yeah, I think that's would be my answer.
That's a great answer. Ziggy, did you want to add anything?
I think I'd like to. I also obviously agree with what Ninan said. I think echoing what Rara had said before and what Helen had already covered from a conversation with Rara, the stories in this anthology, a lot of them are talking about real life problems in Jakarta, but it's barely exclusive. So the editors, the translators, and the authors do not perceive Jakarta as something exotic, but as a real place. I think I simply expect people to perceive Jakarta or Indonesia in general as a real place with a real problem that may or may not already, also exist everywhere else. As someone from outside of Jakarta, I know how people might see this place as something that's almost dreamy because that's what my friends and I felt from outside of Java. So I simply want people to see this place as something real.
I think that's a great answer. Thank you. The next question is from Mikhail, who I think is one of the translators from this anthology, so hello. And his question is, what was the curation strategy for this anthology? I can speak to that slightly from Commerce side. As everyone's kind of already established, this book is from our Reading the City series, which is a series that we've been publishing for over 10 years now. And our strategy with these anthologies editorially normally is to have an in-house editor, so myself or one of my colleagues, who works with the kind of who works with editors from within that country. So in the case of the Jakarta book, we worked with Maisie and Teddy, who are from Post, who did an absolutely amazing job of picking all the writers in this anthology. And we very much, as has been discussed by the panelists here, tap into their local knowledge. We're a UK-based publisher. We don't know what's going on, in every city and every country all over the world, and we very much, defer to their expertise in these sorts of things. We just kind of step in terms of like, we kind of have a policy of not publishing too many dead writers to try and keep them contemporary and relevant. We try and have as many women as men, as many old as young, and the stories have to be about the city, very specifically about that city, in terms of setting. And you should read these stories and only ever picture Jakarta. It couldn't be Tokyo or Sydney or London or anywhere else. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to speak to that, or if I've answered that question. Sorry. But yeah, they're hopefully carefully and lovingly curated, and I hope anyone who reads this anthology enjoys it as much as I did when I read it. I'll move on to the next question because I'm mindful of time. Linda Jones says, an excellent discussion, thank you all. How difficult is it for women to be published in Indonesia? I don't know if any of the panelists want to speak to that, as we're all women. Who wants to be the first woman up?
Sorry, I think I would like to say, I'm not really sure about whether it's difficult to be published. Is it published or to say? But I think it's the most difficult thing is to be acknowledged, because it doesn't matter how you have published, how you have accomplished things. People have a tendency to forget that you have written something, you have won something. So not only that, awards usually go to men still. But even though you have already won something, people either overlooked it or they use you against people who are trying to raise an issue. Like, no, we're not discriminating women. For example, she won like 1,000 years ago. So it's really difficult because you have to be to bear in mind that you might be used as a weapon, and that's really difficult for me. But I'm not really sure about the publishing thing because I use like shortcuts. I kind of submit it to competitions and, so they had to.
Rara, do you want to answer that, or should I go first? Okay, I'll go first. um, yeah, I think I totally agree with Ziggy's answer. I think there are many ways to publish work. You can publish it online even, and then there's online platform who provide you with space to commercialize your work there. So yeah, the problem is how to get acknowledged, and um, I guess I guess being a weapon is very important for us to think about, because yeah, um, that's what is happening many times. I don't know. I don't have any additional to that, but yeah, Rara, you can you can.
I think the situation is most recently there was this literary prize, an award that was uh, by a panel of almost entirely male judges with almost exclusively male nominees. Nominations are predominantly male authors, and then the winners are also predominantly male. And when this was challenged, their uh, justification, the reason was, oh well, we judge writing not based on the gender of the author, but based on objectively whether that's good or bad. And that's very frustrating, of course. And I think some people, some of us use, as Ninin said, other means to get ourselves out there. Ninin's short story, especially, has been around the interwebs for years and years before it was featured by Macy and Teddy in the collection. And also want to point out that Uti Ut's short story was also published in an alternative media instead of published in book. So we find ways. Many underground writers, online platforms. We work with these mediums, I think.
Amazing. I think that's a perfect note to end on, if that's okay with everyone. So I'm just going to say a really quick thank you. Thank you so much, Helen, for hosting. Thank you so much to our panelists for your fantastic insights and stories and translations. You're all amazing. Thank you, Arts Council England, for their continued support of Comma's work. And thank you to the British Council for their support of the translation of this book. And thank you to Maisie and Teddy. I think Maisie's here. Thank you, Maisie. And thank you, Teddy, for editing this fantastic anthology. If you'd like to purchase a copy, it's available from Comma's website or any good retailers, including Post in Jakarta. Thank you all for being here, and we hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you.